I think I wanted to make sure I kept him on board. And then Jeffrey, of course, has been someone that I've had the opportunity to work with a couple different times. And so I thank both of them for the time to come here today, as well as the time to prepare. For those of you who have worked with them, if you are students who are on, you know that these are professors who do not play, and they have prepared well. Matter of fact, when they sent me their notes, I thought, how are you going to talk about all of this in a short period of time? But I'm sure that they will do their best. So having said that, I want to make sure that we go over our rules of engagement again. And this is always important. Please know that in all of these sessions, we want to have meaningful, candid conversations, that the presenters so far have all been people who work here. There are a couple more sessions I have planned that are coming up. And that as people are sharing, this took a lot. People are giving in many ways their personal voice and perspectives. And so I want to make sure that we are always respectful of that. The session is for the topic at hand. We are talking about the history of racial justice and protest. We will not be discussing anything outside of that. So we want to make sure that we stay to the topic. Everyone's voice is valued. I believe I sent out in the email, you have a raise hand feature. And if you do that, when we get to the part of the program where we will have question and answers from our audience, you will be able to do that. I will hover, honestly, over your name or your entry, and that will give you the opportunity to be unmuted and speak. We are in the webinar format, which does not allow for everyone to have voice or to control their mute. It is controlled by me, the host. And so this is the format, but this format does allow us to have a lot more people with us. And so this is important to us. And then let's see what else do I have here. This is a brave space, of course, for our voices to be heard. We want to make sure that we are respectful. Again, we are always giving our own opinions, and this is not the opportunity or the time for us to discount someone's opinion. And then we'll be a respecter of time when we get to the part about having open questions from our community. And so having said that, I think, let me see if I've covered what I needed to cover. Oh, let me say at the beginning, and I'll say it again at the end. Again, our lovely librarians have put together a resource list that speaks to protests and riots. And so I believe there is a link on the library webpage. I sent out the link after the first session that we did, and I will be happy to send out this link. But I want to thank Ms. Gail and Kelly for their work to put this together. They did work with Dr. Carol and Dr. Contasta to get sources together so that if people have an interest in reading and doing more, that will be available. This is being recorded, and we will have the recording probably up on the page's on the college's YouTube channel tomorrow. I think that's it for my opening comments. So we have our panelists, and what they have done, they have prepared some notes, and they're going to actually kind of talk to you today for about 10 minutes, things that they want to share looking at the history of racial justice. Also the political piece. I think Dr. Carroll is going to focus a lot on the concept of power and take us through some of our historical events that we know informs kind of our present and hopefully helps us to dive into our future. So having said that, I'm not sure who's first, David or Jeffrey?
I think I'm going to go first because I'm looking at the background.
Very good. Thank you, David.
Yep. Okay, David.
All right, Juliana said I was tough on her when she was interviewing Jeffrey, has accused me of doing the same thing. So I apologize.
Oh, that was absolutely true.
I'll begin by making an observation. We should all keep this in mind, that the American Revolution, which led to our independence, began in protests, multiple protests. In fact, And that's one reason that the First Amendment does guarantee the right to protest and to petition the government for redress of grievances. As an historian, I believe that we study the past to tell us how we arrived at the present. We don't study the past for its own sake. And it gives us some sense of how we might project ourselves into the future. A lot of people think history repeats itself. Thank God it does not. But as Mark Twain said, it does rhyme. That is, we can see certain patterns in the past, and they can help us to guide our way into the future. So I'll offer a few points on this country's history of racial injustice with some observations of hope at the end. Our country began with two original sins: the desire to exterminate native peoples on this continent and the enslavement of African peoples. Unfortunately, very few colonists felt any sense of sin about what they were doing to African and native peoples. In fact, they believed that as white Americans, white Europeans, they were racially superior to everybody else in the world. Indeed, many believed that God was sending them to a new world as a new chosen people to create there a new Jerusalem, a new promised land. And these beliefs were at the basis of what we call American exceptionalism, for better or worse, a topic we might get into more a little bit later on. Ironically and sadly, many of those Europeans who came to America were fleeing from poverty, religious persecution, or political oppression. Yet, they could not see that African peoples who were captured and brought here against their will longed for the same freedoms and opportunities. They could not understand the common humanity. Nor, sadly, could many members of various religious and ethnic groups who continued to immigrate to America always understood that all of them wanted to share in the same American dream of freedom and opportunity, and all too often sought ways to denigrate and hold back those who seemed different. Two, they could not accept that we're all children of God and commanded to love one another as I have loved you, or to do unto others as you would have others do unto you, or to practice those words we all know from the Declaration of Independence, that all persons are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then, beginning in the 1890s, school children were taught to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, which we all know. That ends with the phrase, with liberty and justice for all, with liberty and justice for all. So we have abundant lessons and admonitions about how we Americans should live together and respect each other. Indeed, these lessons and admonitions are the bases of the great American experiment, that we could invite and welcome people to come here from all over the earth to share in that noble ideal of liberty and justice for all. Unfortunately, we have failed many times along the way to realize that ideal. But I also think there have been signs of hope over the years. Not enough, mind you, but some signs of hope. In 1688, a group of Germantown Quakers signed an anti-slavery petition, the first such petition in any English colony, just down the road from Chestnut Hill College. Though Quakers would continue to own enslaved people until their denomination forbade members to do so in 1776, which I think is rather interesting. By the early 1800s, anti-slavery activists, both black and white in southeastern Pennsylvania and elsewhere, began helping those in bondage to escape to freedom in what became the Underground Railroad. And some of you may know that I'm involved in trying to save Abolition Hall up in Plymouth Meeting. Several 100,000 people gave their lives in the Civil War, including thousands of black soldiers, to end slavery. Sadly, Congress, in a cynical agreement in 1876 over a disputed presidential election, stopped enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments for Black Americans, which gave rise to Jim Crow and hundreds of lynchings. And I'll just say a few words about the 14th Amendment in particular. It defined what citizenship is, or who is a citizen, and it declared anyone born in the United States or naturalized in the United States as a citizen of the United States and of the state wherein he or she resided. It included due process of law clause. No state could deprive any person of due process of law. Equal protection of the law, that is, the states could not treat people differently. And there was the privileges and immunities clause, that is, the states could not afford certain privileges and immunities to some people and not to others. The 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to Black men, although not Black women, because women aren't going to be enfranchised until 1920. Some of you may have seen the Grant documentary that has been on the History Channel lately. President Grant did try to enforce those amendments, but because of the 1876 election, because people simply got tired of fighting with the South, they got tired of trying to emphasize racial issues, the 14th and 15th Amendments are abandoned so far as African Americans are concerned. In 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the worst high court decisions ever handed down, announced a separate but equal rule, which was overturned in Brown versus Board of Education 58 years later. And we all know the terrible resistance that a lot of school districts in the South put up to integration in the 1950s. The Civil Rights Movement successfully pressured Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And those events are extraordinarily important and really deserve a great deal more treatment than we can give here. But the Vietnam War and the backlash against President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society led to a spate of conservative national governments. We thought we'd turned over a new leaf with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, but another backlash in the election of Donald Trump seemed to dash such hopes. Yet I believe that the present peaceful protests over the murder of George Floyd give us renewed hope. Unlike the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s, wherein most of the demonstrators were African Americans, the protesters now include Americans of every background: Blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, Latin Americans, Native Americans, and others. I think another hopeful sign is that younger Americans seem not to be as prejudiced as their elders, and I hope they will carry their views into the future. As a historian, I would close by asking, do we need to institute truth and reconciliation panels in this country, as South Africa has done and other countries have done? For only if we expose and admit the deep hurt inflicted on our African American brothers and sisters can we begin to heal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that great overview. You took us through almost 400 years in a short period of time, so thank you very much. I hope that if people are having questions, you're kind of writing them down, or you are welcome to use the chat feature, and then I will be able to inform our panelists of such. Having said that, if we can now hear from Jeffrey, and who will give us more insight from a political scientist's perspective.
Thank you so much, Juliana, for this forum, and for all the hard work that you do for the college. It's been such a pleasure building with you, dear colleague, dear friend. Thank you, Chestnut Hill College community, for the opportunity to speak on George Floyd and racial justice. It's a formative, crucial time that has led us all to seek meaning. And like you, I've had some mournful days, angry days, tearful days, fearful days, and probably most often confused days. Most recently, however, I've had some hopeful ones. David and I have spoken at least an hour a week for several years about important events in American society. He helps me gain clarity in my thinking. So David, today and always, thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your mentorship. I've learned and am learning so much from you. So my thoughts today and most days are works in progress. What I hope to do is provide some context to the almost insurmountable question: how did we get here? Like you, I too am grasping for answers, and hopefully together And with time, we gain insight, perhaps even participate in solutions. I begin today, I discuss the discipline of political science and study of power. And then I just turn to discuss one way that political science examines political participation and connect that to the thinking, to the idea of citizenship, a theme that David alluded to just a minute ago. And then finally, I'll close with some thoughts about social movements in the United States in the last 50 years that sought to advance citizen rights for Black Americans and more generally has called for Black lives to be treated with dignity in American society. Political science is a study of power. The famed political scientist Harold Laswell has described the discipline as who, guess what, when, and how. And so to that end, one must study government, which is the body of a state who controls resources that's given to the public, and politics, any and all activities related to the function of government. American political science is focused in thinking about the internal mechanisms of the country, and that's the main focal point. And given that the United States is the first liberal democracy, this means that we have a system that's representative, that people have a say, that we elect leaders, and that also embeds many freedoms expressed explicitly in our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and in the First Amendment. It's drawn from the tenets of famous political philosophers like John Locke, who our founding fathers were influenced by. Some would say even plagiarized. This is Western classical liberalism. So the Constitution provides us that right to participate in the affairs of government. And before the United States, there was no such mechanism in the world. It's what David said was the great experiment. How do we participate then? You know, political science looks at this. This is one way. There's conventional political participation, at the core, voting. But there's other things too. Lobbying, donating. Calling our elected officials is one of our most utilized forms of conventional political participation. But then there's unconventional political participation. Protests, what we're talking about today. Boycott, strikes, occupation. These are more aggressive forms of participation, and at times it may break existing rule of law. Rule of law changes over time. Democratic countries allow different forms of participation, and many countries that call themselves democracies actually do not even have the most basic forms of conventional political participation. Some are questionable. So for example, imagine having the power to vote, right? But there's only one political party. There's one candidate on the ballot. The Economist Intelligence Unit, which measures various state democratic values year to year to year, found that globally, democracy had another bad year in 2019, a slide that's been going on globally for 5 years. Suffice it to say that democratic institutions as leadership have been shaky, and there has been a decline in various civil liberties, including freedom of speech, including freedom of the press. John Hoey, the editor of the Democracy Index, concludes, the global march of democracy stalled in the 2000s, retreated in the second decade of the 21st century, but the recent wave of protests in the developing world and the populist insurgency in the mature democracies, talk about us, show the potential for democratic renewal. Many democracies disallow unconventional forms of political participation. However, the United States allows many forms with conditions governed under the rule of law. The foundation of our country, as David noted, it's unconventional. It was revolutionary. It was protest. However, the preservation of the right to petition since the foundation has actually been a very uncomfortable one. Not just right now, but throughout the history of our country. The Constitution, it's clearly provides the right for organization on the condition it's peaceful, okay? It says it. Congress shall make no law respective an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise there or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The first major exercise of this right was through citizens' protests to slavery in the 1830s. Renowned political scientist Roger Smith, in his 1993 work, Beyond Tocqueville, Myrtle, and Hart's Multiple Traditions in America, contends, our society has been so wrapped up in the promises of classical liberalism that we may have lost sight of what is a repeated pattern of contradiction from the founding of our society. He calls this the ascriptive system. Check out this quote. American intellectual and political elites elaborated distinctive justification for these ascriptive systems, identifying the true meaning of Americanism with particular forms of cultural, religious, ethnic, and especially racial and gender hierarchies, aided by those who sat atop of the nation's political, economic, and social hierarchies. So America's dilemma then is that while we ascribe to the ideals of classical liberalism, we may not live up to them. To simplify, the United States has been really far from free, even though it claims to be. It claims to be the land of opportunity, but as Smith says, its systems has created different experiences for different people. It's a slow inclusion of groups that can afford the privileges of full citizenship. That's the operative word, full. At the foundation of the country, there was a specific profile of who can even participate. It's white and Anglo-Saxon and male and Protestant and property owners. It's a very small percentage of the United States, even at the time. Today, the George Floyd protests are a manifestation of that contradiction. It's based on the America's longstanding exclusionary tactics that began with what David alluded to, America's original sin, slavery. Denial of rights and privileges of Black Americans that goes back to the foundation of the country. Full citizenship here is so much more than having a social security number. It's equal access to life, liberty, property, equal protection under the law, state explicitly in the 14th Amendment Constitution. There was a civil war fought for that right 152 years later. Struggle continues. Full citizenship is protection of civil rights and liberties for all. We don't need to look too far back to contextualize the George Floyd protest. It's imperative that we compare rhetoric between social movements and listen to the language of petition, the language of protest. And what you will find is that there are these consistent themes. Let's go to 1967, summer of 1967, the long, hot summer of 1967. 109 American cities, riots across the country. It began in early June, lasting through early August. Mind you, 67, the civil rights movement is 13 years old by that point, starting with the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. It's 12 years after the Rosa Parks bus boycott, 7 years after the first restaurant sit-ins. It's 4 years since Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, 3 years since the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discriminations in institutions on basis of race, 2 years from signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawing discrimination in elections. There were these two incidents in two cities where most devastation occurred in Newark, July 12th through the 17th, 1967, sparked from a Black cab driver, John William Smith, that was abused by police officers after a traffic stop. The police then brought him to this precinct, and several citizens saw him being brought in, his body so badly beaten. They thought that he was dead. A crowd gathered at that precinct. Tensions escalated. Violence would then ensue for 5 days, 700 injured, 26 people killed. In Detroit, this is a couple of years later, couple of weeks later, the police conducted a raid of an after-hours club that was being held in the United Community League for Civic Action. There was a party hosted for veterans that have returned from the Vietnam War. It was terribly hot and humid night, and the police called for the citizens to leave the club. And not wanting to leave the air condition, they lingered, and police arrested all 85 people that were inside. A crowd then spilled onto the street, upset. Riots ensued. It spread so quickly to encompass 100-block area near Virginia Park in Detroit. The National Guard was called in, and after 4 days, it became the second worst riot in U.S. history at the time after the New York draft riots of 1863. 43 people were killed. Just a few months before that, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an address in April at Stanford University before the riots. He practically predicted the summer violence. He says, all of our cities are potentially powder kegs, and goes on to say, but in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility in the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of giving these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. This speech would be dubbed as the Other America speech, in which he would predict the events of the summer of 1967. President Johnson appointed Illinois Governor Otto Kerner Jr. to lead the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder to investigate the riots in 1967. This is known as the Kerner Commission Report, officially known as the National Advisory Commission of Civil Disorders Report. 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again? It would unpack the root causes of the race riots, the Great Death, conclude with specific recommendations for national action, including measures related to employment, education, the welfare system, housing. The primary findings of the report, one line: our nation is moving towards 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It's been 52 years since the Kerner Commission report. The themes evident in Dr. King's rhetoric and in the Kerner Commission report persist today, and the themes carried forth would have some metamorphosis through 2 additional movements. I'm going to mention those movements, and then I have my concluding thoughts. Thank you for listening. The Black liberation movement of the late 1960s, 1970s, unlike the previous era, it called for equality, but the movement was one that departed from the civil rights movement of the 1960s because there was a shift, the shift in balance from being mostly an integration-centered movement to a self-determination-centered movement. Themes of self-sufficiency weave through it, and here the notion of power was central. The Black liberation movement, commonly known as the Black Power movement, and its focus was on the American institutional system, mostly the dominance of whites who control structures. And here, the academy and Marxist scholarship was really a primary influence. In an impassioned speech, Angela Davis, already Professor Davis at UCLA, studied under Marxist political theorist Herbert Marcuse, was masterful, making connections across and between social movements and events of the time. Mind you, the women's liberation movement was happening concurrently, and the Vietnam War too. In addition to making connections about how American political institutions affect the Black experience, racism, of course, was at the root of political repression, but she was consistent in her themes about policing. I have this quote, and I'm going to make my concluding point. The more the movement for my freedom increase in number, strength, and confidence, the more imperative it became for everyone to see as something, not as something exceptional, but a small part of a great fight against injustice, one embowing a solidly rooted tree of resistance. It's not only political repression, but racism, poverty, police brutality, drugs, and all the myriad ways Black, brown, yellow, and white people are kept chained to misery and despair. I can talk about how these themes have influenced the Black Lives Matter movement. My point today is just it's absolutely crucial to understand the tenets of these movements. Can we articulate them? Yes, there is justice needed for George Floyd, and embedded in that message of humanity that Black Lives Matter. Let's listen to the words of those embedded in the movement to produce understanding of Black lives, and without that, cannot begin to make Black Americans whole. Are we finally answering the call, the desperation of our country to have a national dialogue on race? Maybe, but I'm hopeful today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Again, this probably could have been a semester course, and he tried to give it to us in 10 minutes. So I do have some poignant questions that I want to ask. And so the first one, David, I know you talked about the quote that we hear oftentimes, oh, you know, if we don't know our history, it will repeat itself. And you talked about the fact that history doesn't really repeat, but it informs. And so my question is, if history has the ability to inform our present and future, what do you think the history is telling us right now? What is it telling us right now with what's going on?
I think it's telling us that we have tried in the past to deal with injustice, racial injustice. We've made some progress, but we've also failed. There was great hope in the mid-1960s, particularly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that somehow we were going to get things right. And then there was great hope after the election of President Barack Obama, and we keep sliding back. And I think we need to ask ourselves why we keep sliding back. And I think there are multitudinous reasons for that, and I think Jeffrey can speak to this too. Partly because of this hierarchy that exists in the United States and it's reflected in our politics, because demagogues are willing to stir up racial hatred in this country. They've done that again and again and again. That was part and parcel of what George Wallace and others were doing during the Civil Rights Movement, and that's part and parcel of what our present president is doing today. I think there's also fear that again and again has occurred. People are fearful of those who are different. They're fearful that others might take their jobs away from them, or somehow they take pride in being white. And this, of course, occurred in the Old South, but it also is continuing to occur today in the United States. Somehow, the majority of Americans need to understand our common humanity. I am encouraged by what's happening now. I think that the murder of George Floyd was so hideous and so graphic, and like Jeffrey, I've been terribly upset by it and reduced to tears over it. And it's something we can't let go of. And I hope we don't slide back to the tribalism, to the fear, to the political exploitation. Unfortunately, and I think this maybe is a part of our cultural evolution, people from the beginning of time perhaps have been fearful of those who seem different because they don't know how to deal with them. They're afraid they might hurt them. We tell kids not to talk to strangers, in fact. But we need to get around that. And one of the wonderful women in my church, who will be 100 years old this September, Rena Graves, who's a deacon, said until Black people and white people befriend each other and sit down and talk to each other about their common hopes and their common dreams and so forth, we're not going to break through. So we have a lot of work to be done. I don't like to look at the failures in the past. There have been too many of them. But there have also been people of goodwill who have tried and tried and tried to rectify this situation, this terrible racism, and have even given their lives for it.
Thank you. Jeffrey, did you want to add anything to that, or shall I move on? David kind of gave me a little bit, and I was going to lead into the next thing.
Oh, sure, you can ask the next question.
Okay. So, David, you mentioned about this seems different, and so I was actually posing a question. Many people are saying that this particular movement feels different, right? That this movement feels different, what's been going on for the last 2 weeks. And so you just said yourself, it is. Why do you think this movement is different? Is it just because of the heinous situation that everyone was able to witness? Or is it something else? Why are people coming together in a way that we have not perhaps seen before?
It is the heinous situation, and I think it is because so many people of so many backgrounds and ages and races and ethnic groups and religious groups and so forth have been out protesting. And these protests are around the world. There are people in London protesting, in Madrid protesting, in Berlin protesting, not just about what's happening in the United States, but in a sense about what's happening in their own countries. So I think it's different in that sense. Another factor, I believe, is that we have a number of crises coming together at the same time. We have the terrible mistreatment, the terrible murder of George Floyd. And for many African Americans and others too, this is enough. There's been too much police brutality. But we've had this COVID-19 epidemic. And it's clear that it has been much worse for African Americans and other minorities in this country, brown people and Black people. In some cases, the death rate has been twice as high among African Americans as among others. And this has revealed the socioeconomic cleavages in this country, the lack of opportunity for many people in this country, the discrimination which leads to lack of opportunity, the food deserts that exist in certain communities, the lack of access to good medical care. It's torn away the curtain from the argument that we have medical insurance for everyone. We don't. And I hope that one of the reforms that comes out of this is that we have universal health care in this country. It's just and it's fair, but it's also a matter of public health. So we have a number of crises, several crises coming together at the same time. I guess the third one would be, and I'll go out on a plank here, there's a lot of anger and dissatisfaction with the President of the United States. And although these demonstrations are not directed against President Trump specifically, I think they're enfolded in it. So it's unhappy with the President of the United States, unhappiness with the political system that gave rise to Donald J. Trump, the COVID-19 epidemic, which has been much worse for African Americans, the lack of decent health care and access to decent health care, particularly again for Black and brown people. And to me, this is a national disgrace. It's made me feel ashamed of this country and to want to do something to rectify the situation. So I think there's a kind of a perfect storm with all of these elements coming together at once.
Jeffrey, what differences do you see?
Thank you, Julia. I think that this is such a difficult question to answer and a very poignant one. I want to agree with David that I do think it's a perfect storm. And I think what makes it difficult is to think about where you start and what you talk about first. And let me start by saying that although in my points, the themes of previous social movements into this time towards the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that we should realize what is very meaningful about and different about this movement and talk about it. It is truly global, right? In a way that the previous movement, they were international, but this one, the movement has headquarters in the United States, in UK, in Canada, with 40 different chapters. And think about the issues too that it relates to affirming lives to the Black queer and Black trans, Black disabled, Black undocumented people, just in a way that really captures the state of the Black life in the 21st century and the issues of how we talk about this issue today. And I think that it really behooves us to think about the main tenets of Black Lives Matter. Do we know the names of the founders? Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, and how they talk about the movement. So I wanted to answer that question in a way that centers the movement first, and then from there, okay, that the movement itself isn't new because it was started on the back of the acquittal of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was killed in 2013, but the acquittal was in 2014. So we have a little bit of time here to think about how the movement has changed. But just quickly back to David's point, the confounding, the intersecting factors are so many, Juliana. It includes political polarization, the difference between Democrats and Republicans, includes globalization, widening economic inequality, and, of course, police practices. And of course, central to this, right, is the behavior of our political beliefs. We are on a backslide of democratic institutions. And I think in that way, if you put this all together, that's why it is just a time that there's consistent themes, but it definitely is different than the past.
Thank you. So Jeffrey and I have been talking a lot ever since I asked him to do this about, the difference between protests versus riots. And one of the things that I have seen over and over again in social media in particular is everybody wants to quote Martin Luther King. For years we have said, oh, he's not relevant. Why is he all we talk about? But he did have a speech back in 1967 for the American Psychological Association. And he came there in his role as a social scientist, and he shared some thoughts. So I want to read this. And by the way, I know a lot of people are wondering probably why didn't I have videos this time? I'm famous for having video clips. And to be honest, I figured that we have all been inundated with these images of protests, images of riots, images of looting and vandalism, that we just did not need to see that again in this space. So if people are wondering why there were no videos, it was a conscious decision to not have that this time. But I'm going to read this quote. And I know Jeffrey and I believe David are very familiar with it. And I won't read the whole thing, but part of it. Dr. King talked about, he said, urban riots must now be recognized as durable social phenomenon. They may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or to attain control of institutions. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is in their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived Negro to take hold of consumer goods with the ease the white man has during using his purse. Often the Negro does not want what he takes. He wants the experience of taking. But most of all, alienated from society and knowing that this society cherishes property above people, he is shocked. He is in shocking. Yes, he is shocking it by abusing property rights. There are thus elements of emotional terrorism in the violent act. This may explain why most cities in which riots have occurred have not had a repetition, even though the causation conditions remain. It is also noteworthy that the amount of physical harm done to white people other than police is infinitesimal, and in Detroit, whites and Negroes looted in unity. So that was something that he talked about. And interestingly enough, having said that, this past week, there were stats that indicated that all 50 states had riots, 584 cities to be exact. There was even some commentary around the city of New York. The curfew that was given in New York last week was only the second curfew in New York's history. The first was 1943, when a Black soldier returned home from the war and was killed by a white officer. So having said all of this and looking at what King was talking about, what are the differences, I guess, between protests and riots, and what benefits, if any, do you think riots have in this movement? That's loaded. I got you.
Jeffrey, go with that.
I think at the core, we have to start with the difference. The definition that protest is a means of expression of disapproval, right? It's an objection, and that the riot is aggressive. It is the violence. It is the breaking of peace in a group. And what is important here, that in the quote that Dr. King was making, is that he was discussing the ways in which there is an end to, right? The trying to correlate the reasoning for the emotion for the breaking of peace, alluding to the conditions of that, and the effects of the violence, the anger, and what it is, and that's difficult to unpack. And what is important here is that it's important to note how much demonstration is an omnipresent part of American society. We have to put that there, right? That yes, and in your statistic, Juliana, that there was much rioting. There was some physical devastation of buildings, right? And in violence. But mind you, this seems to happen with the scale of, and in a movement of, we're talking about not thousands, millions of people that are taking the street. And in the study in political science about assessing demonstration and protest, is that actually those times of violence actually over history is actually an outlier. So it's important to talk about the conditions. And I think that's part of what Dr. King is alluding to, is because we do have to accept that all the time. One study that I read just on a window of the summer of 2019, that there were 3,500 demonstrations that what they looked at is to the extent that these demonstrations and protests would turn into violence, and it was less than 3%, right? So, and this happens over time. That's very common, and it's just the scale of which that's here, and then making the difference as demonstration, right? And for for what cause. I have a couple more things to say, but I want to make sure that David chimes in.
I just would say that although a small minority of people were involved in destroying property and using violence in the 1960s, it led to a terrible backlash. And in many ways, it led to the election of Richard Nixon, who put himself forth as a law and order person. But that he didn't mean going after common criminals. He meant he was going to crack down on the civil rights movement. He was going to crack down on protests and so forth. So there has to be a delicate balance here. And of course, you can't insist that there is going to be a delicate balance. And that was one of my fears recently, that if there were too much violence and too much destruction of property, that it would lead to another backlash. Now, I think that's what President Trump was engendering to do when he had men in uniform and on horseback outside Lafayette Park, and it backfired on him. And I don't think he's going to be able to use it again, particularly because the protests have become extraordinarily peaceful over the last several days. So I would throw in that concern that there might be a backlash, and that backlash was hurtful 50 years ago.
I want to add here in that we have to contextualize the discussion of violence, in that political violence is people, it can include people or the government for political purposes. Now get this, the World Health Organization defines political violence. You know what they have recently included as a category? Deprivation.
Yeah.
A denial of rights and freedoms for basic things such as speech, food, education, healthcare, as a deprivation by people or by government as part of political violence, not as a cause of, right? Not just as a cause, but in its definition. So I think that it's really important to expand this discussion, and just thinking about that. And it's been consistent over time and among social movements about why it occurs. And now it takes a little bit different twist on the causes. However, the rhetoric has been rather consistent about, and it relates to the idea of deprivation, and that idea was central to the quote, Juliana, that you read. Dr. King said it right in that quote about being deprived.
All right. Last question, and then we're going to open it up to our participants. And I do have a couple of questions that I'm seeing floating around in here already. One of the things I've been watching, of course, is about the protests, have been the cities where the protests have included the people and the police. And so we have two cities, and there are others, but these are just two that I picked. One due to proximity, Camden, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And then I picked Houston because Jeffrey and I both are tied to Houston. We both have lived
H-Town
there.
proud, baby.
Yeah, we have both lived there. So these are two cities. I mean, and Houston is a major city. I mean, you're talking about the third largest city in the United States, where the protest included the police. So you had the police commissioner, typically as a part, I mean, right there on the front lines, also making comments. They took a knee in both cities, the police did with the people. And these are two cities that did not have any instances of violence, looting, none of that. So how, is it fair to say that it made a difference that they were together? What are your thoughts about why those cities didn't have it? And then if you have a thought about maybe why we didn't see that here in Philadelphia, especially given that we have a new commissioner.
Jeffrey knows a lot about Philadelphia politics, so let him answer that.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Juliana, okay. Wow.
You can skip that part and just do the other part if you want.
No. I want to try to tackle it because but I have to say that in attempting to illustrate the actual causation of a specific time or act of violence is very difficult because it's trying to isolate like all of those factors, right? And so this is just speculatory, but it's nice to speculate. And given the cases that you bring up, say for example about Camden is very interesting. A theory could be that the reforms that were made via the police departments in Camden, particularly after 2014, had something to do with the lack of violence there because of the relations are better there. The community police relations are better. Now, was it those reforms that were made in Camden why there was no violence? Well, perhaps. But I think that it's really worth looking at that closer. And what I remember they did is it was just very interesting that they took the city of Camden and pretty much blew up its institution. I'm sorry for the violent language. They just dismantled its structure to allay part of the funding and how its operations with Camden County. So there was this outer cooperation that was there, then built in mechanisms to ease for community policing that was there, changing all kinds of things, its residency requirement for police officers and instituting the reforms. And it was very, very aggressive. So much so that a couple of years ago, while President Obama was still in office, visited Camden and thought it was a really model that other cities should look at. So I think that this has to do this. I like this question because it's really central to thinking about reforms, particularly policing reforms today. And then thinking about how best to really make community policing relations better.
I think the term defunding the police is an unfortunate one because that's not what was done in Camden. They reformed the police and they reformed the budget that was being used. The police themselves have been willing to admit in many places they're not equipped to do with psychological problems, with domestic problems, with health issues, and so forth. And unfortunately, some people have run with that idea of defunding the police. We're going to have anarchy all over the place. And that's not what is meant, it seems to me, as Jeffrey just suggested.
I think so, right? Because I think that semantics there's confusion here because I think that the core of what it's discussing is its idea of divestment. So it's shifting money that would otherwise have gone, let's say in Philadelphia, to a $14 million increase in police department into community relations in marginalized communities, mental health, domestic violence, homelessness. But police are first responders to those things. And then investment of schools, hospitals, housing, and food. And all of us can get down for that idea. I think but there's just something just lost in here because I think many folks are equating defunding the police as let's yank your whole budget or let's not have a police force. So there's definitely some confusion that's elicited there.
And that's going to be used in the presidential election. People are going to say that's what the Democrats are for, don't vote for them, and so forth.
That's probably true. So we do have a question that's been in here. Is some of this not basically a problem of our whole entire political system? And basically, let me see if I can kind of paraphrase this here. Speaking to who runs our federal government, older white folks still, being the majority, and how does that kind of play into the political system and what we're seeing going on?
I think that if you don't have people of color in government, in high positions in government, there's not an understanding of the problems and the issues that afflict that community. If you've lived a fairly prosperous life and have enjoyed white privilege, you have no idea what other people have gone through. So I think that that would make a tremendous difference.
I would agree. I think central to this is the behavior of political elites and the branches of government. I mean, the action of Congress and the laws towards the reforms, the courts and its current interpretation of rights. And folks, it's anomalous time. The role of the president in these times, specifically how the 44th president is now serving as a uniting force, while the 45th president is doubling down on being a dividing one. And that is a running conversation that David and I have shared, because I don't think that you can compare that type of behavior of the political elites, particularly the president, in this time, as I alluded to this in the civil rights movement. Could you imagine a Kerner Commission report today on the back of the George Floyd protests? I mean, that's really what is needed, right? That's what you would want to expect, but it's really far from that. It's really, really far from that.
So one of our other professors, Suzanne, posed a question, and you guys were already talking about what it really means, this whole concept of defunding the police. And you mentioned about putting money back into community services. So she asked, what is the correct role, if there is one, for the police as a part of this movement? What role should they have? And then what, if anything, what can we do, if anything, to change the dynamics between police and Blacks, African Americans in particular? How do we try to positively, I guess, impact that relationship if it can be done?
Well, Jeffrey alluded to that, community policing. Unfortunately, we have many police in urban areas who live out in the suburbs, who come in every day, and they're supposed to have some understanding about people living in the various neighborhoods. That's definitely an issue. And a lot of the money being spent on police could be spent on schools, should be spent on psychological care. And in fact, crime rates have gone down in this country. Violent crime rates have been subsiding for the last 20 years or so. And yet cities are putting more and more money into police forces, and one wonders why. So maybe we don't need as much in the way of police pressure to deal with crime, and that funding could be used elsewhere, as we've alluded to.
Okay. And I was checking to see, let me see. I think I have another one.
Could I make a quick, can I take just 30 seconds on that point?
Go ahead,
Don't mind,
please.
Juliana, because I'd be remiss if I don't try to answer this question, because my buddy Suzanne asked this question, and given some of our shared interest, and I know she teaches, like, and part of it is particularly in the Black arts movement in the 1970s, it was really central what I said in the Black liberation movement about the police state. So I think it happens that we have to think about that the calls for reform have been very long, wide, and been very consistent. And that calls, such as from folks like Angela Davis, that it was really met with, that era was met with force by the police, and in particular the federal government, the FBI, the Department of Justice, had not just followed but kept files for a long time. So it operates both on the level that David was talking about in specific reforms, but there's this really broader conversation about how Black communities have long felt that they have been living in a police state.
I think that in the training, police have to get away from the idea of the we and they. They should see themselves as protectors of the community, protectors of fellow citizens. And if they do come from the community, as they used to in the past, there was no way that people could commute in from the suburb and be policemen. That could do a lot, it seems to me.
Okay. And I know that there are still some cities that actually require law enforcement to live within the cities that they serve. I am originally from Cleveland, Ohio. That is where I grew up as a child. And Cleveland still has that ruling. To be a police officer there, you must live within the city limits. And that was part of the thought, right? Was to make sure that you are from the areas for which you are serving and protecting. And so, David, going back to something you talked about, and I was kind of filling in for questions here. You talked about when, at the beginning of history in terms of this country, there was this need to eradicate the native people who were here. And then, of course, this introduction of slavery. And so here we are 401 years later. And racial justice still has not been achieved. What are the things that we can do? I mean, we're talking about we need to get people together. We need to have conversations. We need people to see people for people, right? But outside of that, what does history tell us about some of the systemic issues that we have, and how do we start to change the systems?
I think we have to change or try to curb human behavior in certain ways, but I think it does begin at many different levels. It begins on the local level, in the college and university level, with study and with discussion. It has to involve city councils and state legislatures. And I think it's important to have someone at the top, to have a president of the United States who has compassion, who's not a divider, who understands the dilemmas that this country faces. And I think we have to stop saying, and Jeffrey and I have talked about this, that we're an exceptional nation. In many ways we are. We're the richest nation in the world. We've got the most powerful military in the world. But we're not exceptional in the sense that we've escaped from original sin. I guess I shouldn't put it that way. But some of those people who came across the Atlantic somehow thought that they were turning over a new page in the book of humanity, and that America was going to be a shining beacon to the rest of the world. And in some ways it is. Jeffrey talked about our being the first liberal democracy. But in many ways we behaved the same as the people we came from elsewhere in the world. And it's just going to take a lot of hard work. We've got to stop bragging about ourselves, looking at who we are. And I think that's why I talked about truth and reconciliation panels. You can't really begin to heal unless you look at what has happened, unless you peel off the scabs. And a lot of people are going to resist that. They're going to resist that maybe this country has done certain things that were wrong, or that maybe they've held attitudes that they shouldn't have held. No one wants to admit that he or she is wrong. That takes a lot of courage. And I'm not sure exactly how to bring that about. It helped me to live in an urban area like Philadelphia. I grew up in a small city in the Midwest where I heard people use the N-word right and left. I had an uncle who used it. I rejected that, but I didn't know Black people as I was growing up there. I didn't know brown people as I was growing up there. There were no Asian people there. And I think that's one reason that living in a metropolitan area where you do have friendships, and I think it is important to have friendships among people of different backgrounds, is important. There's still segregation. There's still residential segregation. If you don't have a neighbor who might belong to a different group, it's hard for you to relate to that person. So there's just a lot of work on a lot of different levels that needs to be done. I think Jeffrey and I were talking about this the other day. one of the most important things for people to do is to vote and vote and vote and vote and fight against voter suppression, which is what was going on in the Old South after the Civil War with Jim Crow. And in an odd kind of way, it's going on now too.
True. We do have another question. This is a good one. This is very interesting. They would like for you to address the history or give some comments on the recent militarization of the police. So we even know that 45, has made comments about how they will use the police, using our military to police, and not just, National Guard, who was brought into certain cities to provide some sense of peace with all of the unrest, but actually saying, we're going to deploy our military on our own citizens.
Well, the militarization of the police, and Jeffrey can correct me, began after 9/11. The idea that the police would need to have all this equipment to combat terrorism in the United States. There's been a lot of blowback, of course, about the president bringing in National Guard and other units that weren't even identified. We didn't even know where they came from, to chase people out of Lafayette Park who were protesting peacefully, and that has backfired. One of the things, by the way, that the founding fathers were afraid of, deathly afraid of, because of the experience they had with the British, is having a standing military, is having a standing army. And there was opposition to having any kind of draft in this country until 1940. We thought that if there were an emergency, then we could form an army, put it together. But we've been militarized since before World War II. And I know that a lot of the National Guardsmen have spoken out now that they felt really upset about being put there in the park to perform that kind of duty. And virtually every high-ranking officer in the services, beginning with Jim Mattis and Admiral Mullen and others, have come out against this. And they're afraid that it will harm the military, because the military itself has taken pride in not being political. And they're afraid that they're going to damage their own reputation. What happens in authoritarian governments, of course, is that leaders use the military to keep themselves in power, or use the military to overthrow somebody else. And that's a path we simply cannot go down. And I think this was alluded to before. I think actually putting military in the midst of demonstrators only is going to stir up a lot of anger and probably incite violence. Once they've been removed, we've had a great deal more peace. Jeffrey?
Well, I agree. I think that particularly if you contextualize that the militarization has been happening in other democracies around the world that have sought to elicit their right to speech and to petition. I think that this is certainly one of several ways in which democratic institutions are at stake. But are at stake, and I get impressed that our president, of course, has the power to do so, and also the way that David, correct me if I'm wrong, it's actually extremely difficult to check that specific power of the president.
Yeah, I've been writing about that. The power of commander-in-chief is probably the strongest power that the president of the United States has. And if he gives an order to the military to go in and quell demonstrations, who's going to stop him? The Supreme Court might tell him to stop, but we've had presidents in the past who've defied the Supreme Court and done what they wanted. And we know that impeachment is not going to work. The framers of the Constitution didn't realize that hyper-partisanship would mean that if the president's party was in control of either house, it was not going to take place. So there's really not much way that a president can be checked. And that's why I'm frightened about what this president might try to do between now and November, and even after he loses the election. Now, hopefully our military would not respond. I don't think they would. they've all taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. But that is a tremendous power. We've had presidents recently who've sent troops into battle without congressional declaration of war. It's very clear in the Constitution that only Congress declares war. So it's something we really need to remedy. It's quite frightening, very scary.
It's terribly frightening. And we have long storied history about when calls of Black power are on the street, that's met very unfavorably by the United States government. And the documents that have been unclassified from the 1960s, 1970s found FBI and Department of Justice traced movements at every turn to the point that they were illegal. So in all of those groups that were involved, in addition to not just organizing groups, members of the arts movement, poet Amiri Baraka, for example, and I think that this is all part and parcel to a very unsettling conversation here about oversight and broadly militarization, Juliana.
All right. Well, we have one last question from our audience, and then I will ask you one question, and we're going to wrap up. So given that, of course, we are an institution of higher learning, I think this is a great question, and both of you are professors. So the person basically is saying, you know, a lot of what we're talking about seems to be kind of in an echo chamber, that, you know, when you talk to many people, they don't understand the history of racism and its foundation of America, of that being our story. And so the question was, how can we change our nation's history curriculum? Perhaps this might be the only way that we can move forward. So how do we change the curriculum? How do we change what's taught?
Good.
David, are you okay? You kind of
Yes,
went
I'm
out.
here.
All
I'm
right,
here.
there you go. Go ahead.
Yeah. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, okay, I think we lost you for a second. So the person is asking or saying that basically a lot of the conversations that we're having today are kind of in an echo chamber, and rarely do people understand how racist this country is and how it's the foundation for who we are as a nation. And so the question is, how can we then change our nation's history curriculum? Perhaps this might be the only way for us to move forward. So how can we change what's taught?
Well, I'll respond to that a little bit. A lot of institutions, universities and churches, for example, I'm an Episcopalian, we're looking at racism in the church. We found that even parish priests owned enslaved people in various places. Individuals who made money out of slavery gave money to the diocese and to the church. And this is a rather small example of what we can look at. Although slavery was abolished in Pennsylvania in 1780, it was done gradually, and I won't go into all of that. A Pennsylvania person could still own enslaved people in the South, even though he or she lived in Pennsylvania. And Pierce Butler, who lived in what is now the Philadelphia Club, which I think is 13th and Walnut, owned 900 people on his plantations in Georgia, and he used a lot of that money to support his parish. Even farmers out in Montgomery County, just above the college, were growing grain that was ground in the Wissahickon mills to flour, sent down to Philadelphia and put on ships, and it went down to the West Indies to feed enslaved people there, because the folks who owned them didn't want to waste time growing corn. They wanted to grow sugarcane and other crops that were valuable. So even the farmers around here, unknowingly perhaps, were making money out of slavery. Philadelphia shippers, Philadelphia bankers, Philadelphia insurance agents, Philadelphia business people were making heaps of money out of slavery all the way up to the Civil War. In fact, there was a Philadelphia-Charleston connection with the families intermarrying, because business people in Philadelphia were doing business in Charleston, and their young folks would get to know each other and get married. There are a number of leading families in Philadelphia who come out of that Philadelphia-Charleston connection. And I know I grew up, and in school we thought, oh, well, slavery was bad. Then there was the Civil War, and the good, moral Northern people fought the South and freed the slaves. And it was just the bad Southern people who did this. I didn't learn that there was slavery in all the 13 colonies. including Pennsylvania. I didn't learn that people in the North were continuing to make money out of the slavery, that the capital was formed from slavery is at the base of industrialization in this country. It just was, you could will a person you owned to your church. You could will a person that you owned to your school. Enslavement of human beings just honeycombed the entire country. And I think we need to take a look at that too. Not just, oh, well, bad Southerners, good Northerners, and we fought the war and we were good guys and they were bad guys. And that's sort of the school kid. I don't know whether it is now, but that's the version I got.
Gotcha. So maybe we need you to write a history book for what's one of the big companies, Macmillan Press or something.
I don't know about that. But no, Jeffrey and I should do that together.
That's what it sounds like we need. So final question. We've talked a lot today, and I want to leave the same final question with you, with the panelists that I had last week. And it's basically this: with so much despair and a history that we seem to not be able to break away from, do you still have hope? And if so, what does that hope look like for you, for our nation, as we move forward?
Take that, Jeffrey.
I have a lot of hope. I guess I've been grappling with the question of how to spark, whether we're really engaging into a national dialogue on race. Man, I have to tell you, to admit that just don't know how that happens, but what I can attest is that I know when I feel it. Just in the last couple of days, to think about the criminal justice reform legislations that across the country and what those proposals have been. The statues and other symbolism memorializing those who have committed offenses against Black lives have been taken down. NASCAR banning the Confederate flag from flying at its events. So I have a lot of hope, and I don't have to go far when these things happen. It's a generational change, and I have a lot of hope, particularly with how the youth are wonderfully civically engaged in a way that I believe that previous generations, including my own, was not. And that gives me a lot of hope in moving forward and to addressing these very complex questions, the question of race in America.
Thank you. David?
Yes, I'm hopeful too. I guess I alluded to that before because of the large numbers of people who are involved in these protests. I don't know what it's like to be African American. I can only begin to imagine. If I had a son, I had to instruct in how to deal with the police. If he were pulled over, I'm thankful that I don't have to deal with that. And so I'm the first to admit that I don't know what it's like. And I value Jeffrey's friendship for that matter, for that reason.
Thank you very much. This has been a very eye-opening, I think, conversation, discussion, and a nice, quick, brief history and political science class. So thank you for doing that as well, and for your candor and sharing of your thoughts. It's not always easy to do that in the context of our work environment. So I appreciate our panelists, Jeffrey and David, for being with us and for sharing and enlightening all of us. I thank you again to all of our participants, attendees who got into the session. I think at our top numbers, we were around 90-something people who are in here with us today. So thank you for coming out. In his comments of hope, Jeffrey talked about he has hope because of the young people, the younger generations who are at the helm of this movement. And so actually that is going to be our next series, the next component of our series. I do not have the date as of yet, but I will be reaching out to our students because I would like to hear the voice of our millennials, our younger millennials, and our Gen Z in particular, to gather their comments and feelings about what's going on currently in our country and how it is affecting them and the things that they are doing. So I do hope that we had a lot of our faculty and staff in this session today, as well as alumni. I hope that when we advertise for the next one, that you will come back and see what our students have to say, and that you will be supportive to their voice, because I think it's important to hear. Lastly, I want to thank Sister Carol again for giving me the opportunity to do these sessions, and it's her leadership that makes this easy. And then a reminder, again, I said this at the beginning, but if you're on now and you didn't hear this, there is a list of resources that have been put together by our wonderful librarians. They worked with Jeffrey and David in particular to put together a lot of resources around protests and riots. So please go to our website. I will send out the link when I send out the link for the recording of this that will be made available on YouTube probably on tomorrow. So it's a great resource. Oh, let me say, speaking of resources, so I found 2 today that I could not get to the library, but I'll see if they can add them. This book just came out. It's called 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City by Wes Moore. This book speaks to one of the other unfortunate tragedies, which was Freddie Gray, who was killed a couple years ago. And then there is an article that was just published yesterday in The Atlantic. The author is Wesley Lowery. Why Minneapolis Was the Breaking Point. Black men and women are still dying across the country. The power that is American policing has conceded nothing. And so I found this one to be really good. He was actually interviewed this morning, and I had the opportunity to see his interview. And so that's where we stand. So again, thank you so much to everyone. This concludes the second of our I Can't Breathe series. And again, like I said, we will be back with our students maybe in another week or 2. It's going to take me a little bit longer to corral them. And then we'll keep the conversation going throughout the summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you for setting this up. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful to have been included.
Thank you so much, Juliana.
Thank you.